Well, in 2008, I bought shares in a phosphate company. What's phosphate? Well, it's an active ingredient in fertilizer. At the time, people were talking about how there were food shortages and how there was more and more fertilizer needed in order to get more food. And so, though random, it seemed like a pretty good investment. And it was a good investment. I thought it was so good that it was going to be my ticket to an early retirement. I had this great hope and ambition of just kind of kicking back and cruising around the world. In January of 2008, I bought shares at 50 cents. By April, it was $2.80. I'll let you do the maths about how rich I was going to be. I was pretty excited. And I wish the story ended there. Actually, if the story ended there, I might not even be here today. But it doesn't end there. Expectation doesn't always end up in reality. And so what happened was that the share price went down. And it went down, and I thought this was certainly going to go back up again, so I bought a bit more of the stock. But it kept going down and down. Now over 10 years later, guess where the stock is at? I would love to say it's past $2.80, it's doing great, but actually it's pretty average. It's worse than average. The stock price is now about 1 cent. So sad. So sad. The things that we place our hope in, they don't always really deliver on what they promise. Sometimes the things we hope in actually don't lead to glory, they lead to shame. They lead to shame, don't they? Paul, who wrote the letter of the Philippians, he writes it to a church in Philippi, and he's writing it from a jail cell. But even though he's in jail, Paul talks about living with this unashamed hope. This hope that gives him this ability to be joyful in the midst of being in prison. What does it mean for us to be people that live with such joy in suffering? Well, as we look at Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 to 30 today, we're going to dig a bit deeper to see what Paul can teach us about living with this sense of joy in suffering. Two things that I want you to note today. The first is that we have to see the good in the bad. The second is we have to see the eternal in the present. So two things that I think Paul gives to us. The first thing, see the good in the bad. Multiple times throughout Paul's letter, he talks about being in chains. Verse 7, 13 and 14. So we know that he's struggling. Paul is isolated. He's not necessarily certain about his future. In many ways, he occupies a very similar situation to us. We're isolated, we don't know what's going to happen. But instead of being anxious or scared, verse 18 tells us that he's a man that rejoices. He lives with a sense of joy. Why? Well, it's because he sees God sovereignly in control of all things. God is sovereignly in control of all things. That allows Paul to see the good in amidst all the bad. Look there with me at verse 12. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. Ironically, being in prison doesn't slow the work of Paul. It actually accelerates it. And do you notice there, verse 13? Because Paul is in prison, he has an opportunity to speak with prison guards that he might never have even been able to talk to were he not in prison. But there's more that happens, right? Verse 14. Some of his friends, people that also speak about Jesus, become emboldened. And they don't have this fear, but they do all the more to proclaim the gospel, knowing what has happened to Paul. And then there's verse 15. Even Paul's rivals start to proclaim the gospel in Paul's absence. Despite imprisonment, the good news of Jesus keeps on going forward. Isn't that amazing? I wonder if we, like Paul, are able to see the good in the bad. Paul constantly reminds us that God so often is up to good in the bad. Romans 8:28. You might have memorized this verse. And we know in all things God works for the good of those who love him and have been called according to his purpose. Those with eyes of faith can see the good amongst the bad. I mean, think about the coronavirus situation that we're currently in. There is so much horrible stuff that's happening. People are either sick or dying. People have lost their jobs or even their businesses. People feel alone and isolated. Yet amongst all this, I really feel there is a sense in which God is creating unique moments in which the good news of Jesus is going forward. Is it possible that amongst all this bad, there is good? Distractions are being removed from people. People's hope in worldly things are being reevaluated as those things disappoint. They're being given more time and space to think about what is life all about. Despite the bad, is there much good to see? See, as we see the good and the bad, Paul has this kind of sense of joy. It equips him to live with this kind of amazing perspective. Look there at verse 18. What does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. Because of this, I rejoice. Now, I don't want you to get to this idea in your mind that hard things in life don't affect Paul. It's very likely that the suffering he's facing, the anxiety of not knowing his future, the discouragement of his enemies kind of working against him, those things that kind of weigh in on him, oppress him, so to speak. But despite these potential challenges, Paul rejoices because he sees the good and the bad. And so the good starts to outweigh any sense that the anxiety consumes him or the discouragement from his rivals overwhelm him. Paul is able to see the good, and because of that, it leads him to a sense of joy. I think really there are two kinds of people in this world. There are those that are glass half full people, and I know some of you are glass half full people. You have this wonderful ability to kind of look at a situation and be quite positive about it. Sometimes you're annoyingly positive, but that's a good thing because you just see God who is at work. And I really want to encourage you to continue to do that, to continue to see God at work in all things, regardless of maybe how difficult it is sometimes. To persist in that, because I think that's a really biblical and godly thing to do. But for some of us, we're not glass half full people, we're glass half empty. And so often we rob ourselves of joy because we become preoccupied with the bad. And we focus so much on our lives and how they're less comfortable by the things around us. Or we focus on those that kind of make trouble for us. And because we become preoccupied with these things, we become overcome by the emotions of our suffering. We can't see the good through it all. And so I just want to encourage you today to be someone that sees the good, to see God acting amidst really difficult circumstances. And so that's the first thing I think we can learn from Paul. The second is that Paul sees the eternal in the present. He sees the eternal in the present. Look there with me at the end of verse 18. Paul says, I will continue to rejoice. And then in verse 19, he goes on to say, for what has happened to me will turn out for my deliverance. He rejoices because he knows that God will deliver him. And that's why Paul is joyful, because he knows that God will act. But let's just pause for a second and consider, what does it mean that God will act? Or what does it mean that God will deliver Paul? In one sense, Paul might have this confidence that God will break him out of jail somehow. That's a potential option. Another option is that God will not necessarily rescue him from jail, but on the last day, he will rescue him from judgment because of his sin. I want to suggest to you that it's more likely that Paul's thinking about that second option, that God will rescue him from judgment. A number of things in our passage kind of suggest that to us. The first thing is there in verse 20. Look there with me. Paul talks about this unashamed hope that happens in life and or in death. Regardless of what happens to him, regardless of what happens to his trial or his imprisonment, Paul has this hope that persists beyond the present. And so it seems to me to suggest that Paul is not just thinking about his freedom, but ultimately his deliverance from judgment. The other thing that I think really keys us in onto this is in verse 19. Paul says, this will turn out for my deliverance. This is actually a quote from the book of Job. If you don't know who Job is, Job was a figure in the Old Testament, so the first part of the Bible. And the way the writer describes Job is that he was a righteous man. He didn't do anything wrong. God loved him and he loved God. And because of that, God blessed him. And because of that, Satan said, "Oh, Job only loves you because you bless him. If I took it all away, he's going to curse you." And so God permitted suffering to come onto Job. Job lost his children, his wealth, his property, basically all the things that he was blessed with, he lost. And so some friends came and they tried to comfort him. And they suggested to him, actually, all this suffering happened because of what you've done. There are things in your life, sin, discretions against God that you need to confess, that you need to own. In Job 13, Job talks about being confident, certain that on the last day he will be vindicated. He'll be spotless and blameless in the face of God. And so I think as Paul quotes Job in Job 13:16 here, Paul's also saying that on the last day, God will vindicate him. He won't face the shame of judgment. Paul's confident that because of Jesus, he will not be judged or condemned, but enjoys God's favour upon him. And so can you see here how the eternity is kind of bleeding into the present? Paul lives with a joy and an unashamed hope because he knows about what will happen. And because he knows what will happen, this propels him into the world to live for Jesus. It's kind of summarized there for us in verse 21, how the eternity kind of bleeds into the present. Look there with me, verse 21, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." There is this kind of single-minded focus that Paul has on Jesus. His life is dedicated to his service. He does everything for Jesus. Listen to how Paul writes about that experience in Galatians 2 verse 20. "I've been crucified with Christ. There's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." Paul's earthly life is radically reoriented around his eternal and heavenly citizenship. But not only is his life dedicated to Jesus, but even in his death he thinks about Jesus. Now for many of us, we think that death is the end, there is no more. But for Paul, it was just the beginning. In death, Paul attains what he's longed for his whole life, to be with Jesus. See, Paul knew that he would be with Jesus one day. Until that day, he continued to see the good in the bad and faithfully serve Jesus with everything that he had. Even in chains, he lives with this deep contentment and joy, confident of his final destination. That was his motto: to live is Christ and to die is gain. If you were to pause right here and to write down on a piece of paper your life motto, what would it be? I mean, if you kind of looked at your week and thought about the things you spent time doing and wrote out your life motto based on what you did, what would it look like? Would you write, to live is Christ, but you don't just do Christ stuff, like plus work, sleep, because you sleep a fair bit, work, family, wealth, hobbies? What would it be? What would it be? If you were really honest, would it be, for me to live is my family, or my spouse, or my kids? Or for me to live is my career, feeling a sense of accomplishment and achievement? For me to live is happiness, just seeking a sense of satisfaction and contentment with the things of this world. That's what living is all about. I'm not sure if you've ever met someone that's a bit eccentric or crazy. They're a bit fanatical about things in their life, and it might be they can't just stop talking about knitting or about golf or about AFL or whatever it is. They just keep talking about it. They have no social awareness that they're just giving you too much information. They just keep on going. I'm not sure how you respond to them. Sometimes I kind of nod and go, yeah. I guess you put up with them, but you think they're a bit weird. Sometimes I think that it's really tempting to think about Paul in the same way. That he's a bit eccentric, a bit crazy, that he doesn't understand the pressures of living in the 21st century. They didn't have a mortgage, he didn't have a family or the distraction of social media, and because of that he could live his kind of eccentric lifestyle. And in many ways sometimes the temptation is to go, well, Paul, that's a bit extreme, that might be good for you, but I'm not sure about me. But I wonder in those moments if the problem is less about the intensity of Paul and more to do with our own hearts. Is it possible that Paul's not too extreme or intense, but we're just not intense or extreme enough. The other day I was reading a book called Enjoying God by Tim Chester, and he asked this question in one of the first few chapters. He says, do you like God? Do you like God? I'm not sure if you've tried to answer that question before. Or we might have been asked, do you love God, but do you like God? What does it mean to like someone? Well, it means you want to spend time with them. It means when you're away from them, you kind of want to be in their presence. And when you're in their presence, you're not kind of looking at your watch going, oh, how much longer? But you're like, oh, it's gone so fast. I've just had such a good time. So I think it's really interesting. We can love God, or we can love things like our siblings, but we don't necessarily like them all the time. They can be a bit annoying. Do you love God but not like Him? Does being with God for all eternity sound a bit, dare we say, boring? But if we love God but don't like Him, is it possible that maybe the things of this world have so consumed our own hearts that, well, the reality is we don't really love God at all? Paul's heart was captured by God. He didn't just love God, but longed to be with Him. And because of that, his eternity shaped his present, and he lived with this wonderful sense of joy. He didn't just see the good and the bad, kind of having positive thoughts, but he saw God in all parts of this. And because of that, he was excited about what was happening. As we come to the end of our time together, I just want to ask you a very simple question. Do you live with a single-mindedness about Jesus? Do you live with a single-mindedness about Jesus? Sometimes we do, but sometimes we don't, right? Life can get so busy, we can be distracted by many things, and because of that, we forget Jesus. Sometimes I'm allowed in the kitchen to help cook, and often I've been given the task of roasting peanuts. It's a pretty easy job. You just sit there and make sure that the peanuts don't burn. You would think that I would be an excellent peanut watcher, right? But sometimes I get bored, I sort of like start looking at my phone or walk away, and then I burn the peanuts. But if you cook a meal, it's not just watching the peanuts. There are so many things that you need to do. You're frying the onions, you're grilling the meat, roasting the potatoes, chopping the garnish. You're doing all kinds of things at the same time. And so you're switching between them. Onions, meat, garnish, meat, onions. But the onions. Life is a bit like that. We're constantly sort of switching between different things. Careers, relationships, family, hobbies, traveling, cafes, old friends, new friends, church. It's all a blur. Amidst all of this, there's a potential that we are people that lose sight of God. Listen to what John writes in 1 John. He says, "And now, dear children, continue in Him so that when He appears, we may be confident and unashamed before Him at His coming." So preoccupied by what is happening around us, it's possible that we find ourselves ashamed when Jesus returns because we've failed to remain in Him. But the Bible doesn't leave us in despair saying, watch out. It gives us hope because it reminds us of what Jesus has done. And Jesus, on the night before He was crucified, we find Him praying, and He turns to His Father and He says these words in Matthew 26:39, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me." The cup in the Old Testament was a symbol of God's righteous judgment against wrongdoing. And Jesus' uncertainty about His future was less about the physical aspect of His suffering and more about experiencing the shame of God's judgment. And Jesus longs to be apart from the judgment and the wrath of God. But He lives in humble obedience and He dies on the cross. See, Jesus, though innocent, faces the shame of a guilty criminal. He is judged and executed on the cross and experiences the judgment of God. And He does this so that you, God's people, who should rightly face the shame of judgment, will not face that, will not be condemned in your guilt, but be exalted and be welcomed into the presence of God because of what Jesus has done. And see, as we see Jesus, who gives everything for us, He calls us to place our faith in Him. And He says to you this morning, live for me. Give your whole life for me. Give everything. But know that as you do, as you invest everything, in pouring yourself out for me, you'll never be put to shame. Because even if you give it all up and you follow me, and people look at you and say, what a waste. They had so much and they gave it all and look, they just died. Know that it will not be a waste, because on that last day, I'll raise you up. You will be mine, an heir of the kingdom. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15, therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor is in the Lord is not in vain. Paul is so convinced of this reality that he gave his whole life to Jesus. He sees the good and the bad. He lets the eternal bleed into his present. And because of that, he lives with this kind of unshakable joy. I don't think he's smiling every day, going, yeah. But I think he is living with this sense of joyful confidence and hope that it's going to be okay. Do you live with a remarkable joy? Do you live with an unashamed hope? And I think God calls you this morning to live your life with a greater clarity. And that clarity might look like that you've started to place hope in the wrong things. Maybe you've sought joy in the things of this world. And so for you, it might be to reconsider what you're placing your hope in. Reconsider where you're finding your joy. And actually thinking about whether Jesus is someone that you need to think about more. But for all of us, I think clarity means to recalibrate our lives, not for the present, but for our eternities. Is it possible that you are too preoccupied with what is happening in this world, and so devoted to this world that you become, absent in God's eyes? I don't think we're all to be like Paul, to maybe go to a distant country and speak about Jesus, or even go to the next suburb and speak about Jesus. But we are to be decidedly single-mindedly Christian in all that we do. We are to be Christian parents and Christian accountants, Christian cafe goers, Christian fitness enthusiasts. Wherever we go, we are to be defined by our love and service of Jesus. And that might look like telling others about Jesus, but it might just look like sharing the love of Jesus through practical ways. Both these things are reshaped and reoriented around a love of Jesus. How is God challenging you and speaking to you this morning? Let me pray. Gracious God, please help and strengthen us for service of you. Help us to be captured by eternity, and so in so doing that, live single-mindedly, solely for you alone. I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.